Thank you, Richard. Yeah, thanks everybody. I want to just thank in particular some people who have helped host me here, Anne Hamlin over in the library and the Digital Humanities Lab, whose space we've been in twice, and certainly Tom Haig and the School of Information Science, who I believe are co-sponsoring my visit and who have been very generous and hospitable. And then, of course, Emily Clark and the C21 staff, and Stuart and Richard and the C21 fellows for inviting me. I've really been looking forward to this. And it's true. After I'm wrapping up the word processing book, and for me, after writing about word processing, there was only one topic that presented itself, and that was obviously sand tables. So that's what I'll be talking about today. I just want to say too that it would be prestigious to come here under any circumstances, given the long tradition Milwaukee has had its place in critical thought, postmodern thought. It's particularly it's not only, I think, prestigious, but it's very much a privilege to be here right now under present circumstances, which all of us have been, across the country following very closely. And for me to do my small part in furthering the sort of normalcy of intellectual life at the institution at this particular moment is very meaningful. So thank you for that. Let's see. And this is about a 40 or a 45-minute talk. So, scenarios, forecasts, projections, contingencies. We could add other words to the list, but these are sufficient, I think, to cover much of the reality space for everyone in this room in recent months. For the public university system in which I work, the tide of events has not been so tumultuous, at least not yet, but with a $47 million reduction in state support, roughly a third of which will be absorbed by the College Park campus, and a 5% tuition hike projected for the fall, most Maryland faculty of conscience and awareness have had occasion to game out some scenarios of our own. More acutely, the English department in which I teach, as documented just last week in the Washington Post, has experienced a nearly 40% drop-off in its majors over the last 5 years, a consequence of the confluence of a restructuring of the university's general education requirements and the immense socio-cultural forces arrayed against non-vocational education as such. What does that mean for the way we do our work? What does it mean for literary studies broadly construed to include media and cultural studies as well? That, I can assure you, is a scenario my colleagues and I have all spent some time pondering. William S. Burroughs once said that the only true game was the war game. So many of us in higher ed have been wargaming individual and collective futures of late. I begin here because what follows is a talk about a particular technology, albeit a crude one by some measures, and certainly a seemingly arbitrary or obscure or perversely martial one by others. But one way, I believe, of exploring the meaning of these and like words, these words, is the scrutiny of the technologies that have historically functioned as material supports for realizing and instantiating them. And that is the work that will preoccupy us this afternoon in suitably granular form. However, there are also relevant discursive frames to keep in mind, and we would do well to attend to some of those at the outset. As with my key words, my pull quotes are selective, and doubtless there are others I could use to fade in the subject, but the first is from William Gibson's 2003 novel, Pattern Recognition, sometimes hailed as his first 9/11 novel. Gibson's phrasing here, as always, is possessed of a terse lyricism that I have never been able to much resist, but it is also, it seems to me, the stance of capitulation, and is voiced by a character. If you know the novel, it's voiced by a character, Vauban, who is the literal, corpulent, corporeal embodiment of capital in that novel. We only have risk management, the spinning of the given moments, scenarios, pattern recognition. The second text is from Richard Grusin, who takes pains to distinguish what he terms premediation from prediction in an instrumental sense, and we should all aspire to one day write something that rings so basically true to daily lived experience. Finally, speculation, whose most extended gloss to date may arise from the work of the anonymous Uncertain Commons authors and their collective text, Speculate This. If you don't know it, it's an ebook. It's ebook only, published by Duke University Press. Speculate This, and I'll give people a moment to read and absorb. So again, these are merely discursive framings, backdrops to be used for thinking with what follows. Does speculation, a word heavily associated as we see here with algorithms, arbitrage, and other financial or cognitive abstractions, also have a material culture, a genealogy of forms? This paper, which is an elaborated version of a talk I gave at SCMS last month, is the beginning of a new project that seeks to confront that question, the material culture of speculation, by bringing together media and military history, the non-human particulars of an especially malleable materiality, and what we might think of as quite literally platform studies. My paper is speculative in its ambitions as well as its topical address, but I hope affirmatively speculative, what Uncertain Commons defines as living towards the future. And put more plainly, this means that this is very much work in progress, and I will welcome your thoughts for further and future development. So, media determine our situation. This is, as everyone knows, the uncompromising opening line of Frederick Kittler's gramophone film typewriter. The lines that directly follow it, however, are less well-known, less ringing, and certainly quoted less often. They promote Gottfried Benn, the poet obsessed with mortality and the mortification and decay of the flesh, who also appropriately served the wartime Wehrmacht as a military doctor. Situation conferences were held by the German General Staff, great ones around noon and smaller ones in the evening, in front of sand tables and maps in war and so-called peace, until Dr. Gottfried Benn, writer and senior Army doctor, charged literature and literary criticism as well with the task of taking stock of the situation. His rationale in a letter to a friend, as you know, I sign on behalf of the Chief of the Army High Command, Dr. Benn. So this terse passage, and again I must emphasize, only the second paragraph of Kittler's most widely read book in English, is hopelessly gnomic and opaque, without benefit of its footnotes, from which we may reconstruct that take stock of the situation is in fact a quotation from Benn's 1947 novella, The Ptolemies, while his martial signature is lifted from a 1941 letter to F.W. Eltsey, his lifelong correspondent. Kittler, already word processing in every way that mattered, uses his keyboard to enjamb the two sources. Media thus determine the situation of both war and literature, certainly a bedrock maneuver for the operations that follow. Or perhaps it is the other way around. In Kittler, quote, the medial a priori collapses into a martial a priori, is how Geoffrey Winthrop Young puts it. take stock of the situation, as Kittler's footnote attests, is an imperative that Ben recycles directly from German military doctrine. Not acknowledged in the notes, or in the footnotes, or in any other commentary I have seen, is that the situation of which Kittler speaks is in fact the scenario. In German, it is Die Lage, which is the scenario governing play of the Kriegsspiel, the tabletop military simulation inaugurated in early 19th century Prussia with the same maps and sand tables that, as Kittler here reminds us, were still in use in the twilight of the Reich. This present work of mine might thus be understood as an extended and circuitous gloss upon that realization. The sand table itself, as we will see, has been used as a material support for both military planning and narrative storytelling, yet it has only rarely emerged from its place in a litany of indoor instruments and activities, all of them loosely termed winter work or Winterarbeit by the German general staff to differentiate them from actual field maneuvers conducted in more temperate seasons. Broadly speaking, I would align the sand table with what Shannon Mattern has usefully termed intellectual furnishings, by which she means chairs, desks, bookshelves, even server racks and other accoutrements of digital infrastructure. The sand table is also just such a neglected relic as catalyzes the recovery project of the media archaeology movement. Unlike the intricate magic lantern phantasmagoria and the alien or unfathomable devices so beloved by media archaeology's curators, however, the sand table is hardly an apparatus at all. Its construction is simple, though not without specification and art. Its complexity, however, is coterminous with the granularity of its constituent medium, including the physical properties of the sand's particulate composition, as well as the application of moisture or pigments or other external agents by the table's administrator. Today, there is a direct genealogy between sand tables and augmented reality platforms, several of which self-consciously adopt the sand table metaphor as the basis for a horizontally aligned reconfigurable surface on which tangible and haptic interfaces with geospatial overlays for training and instruction in a variety of different application domains. A tactile space for the rehearsal of tactics, staccato words whose roots lie in touch and arrangement. And let's see if we can play a video. Let's see, I need the mouse pointer to control the video, to actually control the slide. There it is. Yeah, I got it. Yeah.
Chris, the software is free.
Go. Really? That's neat.
Online from California.
Yeah, it must have been an open source thing that someone did. It's pretty neat.
We should get it now.
I think what Scott said is that this is what's cost $100.
Yeah.
It's like a PlayStation or Xbox thing or something.
Xbox 360.
Is it?
Yeah, this is Xbox 360.
So that's really,
Right.
if you had an Apple computer and a projector, that's really all you need to buy.
Plus the Xbox thing, yeah.
He built this.
Yeah. So what's happening here is there's a projector mounted directly overhead that's sort of projecting the sort of topographic contour lines and such, and through some sort of sensor technology, the color filters are responsive to the physical height of the mounds of sand, and as people sort of push it around and mold it and reshape it on the table, the mapping overlay alters, changes in real time. So just an example of sort of the ongoing sort of contemporary relevance, the sort of interest in the sand table metaphor. Let's see if we... Despite his privileged positioning at the outset of Hitler's cosmography, Gottfried Benn, there he is, hardly reappears in those pages until near to their end. as one of the clinical cases presented deep in the final typewriter section. Hitler's interest there rests upon the love triangle between the poet, his newlywed wife, which is the daughter of a member of the High Command, and two flames back in Berlin. Hitler suggests, and the evidence supports, that Ben's was a marriage of companionship, quote unquote, and that among its other compensations allowed him to finally secure a typist for his poems and thereby lift him out of the depression. Total war thus coincides with the typewriter's absolute mobilization of literature, which is to say writing. But his bride and secretary, Herta von Werdemeyer, was to commit suicide at the end of the war. Just as Hitler's opening use of Ben hinges on the preposition until to effect the transition from a regimen of military oversight to post-war poetics, here we are left to decide whether his wife is the casualty of poetry's dead letters or the more general strife. The following case but one takes us straight to Hitler's Wolfschanze, or the Wolf's Lair, his wartime headquarters in the forests of East Prussia, and the scene of those sand table and map briefings, often explosive occasions, hardly distinguishable from what is parodied in the internet's downfall meme, which I'm sure people have seen. Hitler uses both Ben and the drama at the Wolf's Lair to set up the book's last major move, the supposed fusion of typewriting with numeracy and computation in the device of the High Command's Enigma machine. Now, as one expert says, sand tables have been used by military planners since, well, pretty much as long as there have been both sand and military planners. In fact, their origins lie in the techniques of counting and accounting. The sand table, or Greek abax, was a progenitor to the familiar abacus. Just as wooden tokens were threaded onto dowels in the Far East, the Greeks created a purposeful assistive device by spreading sand across a wooden board. Pebbles were then sorted and manipulated in columns or grooves scored on the surface layer of sand to help the user work sums. From the outset of the history of this particular form, then, we confront a genealogy of computation, as the title of this 1961 general audience book makes clear. Yet more evidence that, as Wolfgang Ernst has also reminded us in his philology of the Old English word telon, numeracy and narration, counting and telling, may not be so dissimilar. But our initial site for today is not Silicon Valley, but rather the seminar rooms and lecture theaters of first the Continental and then British and American military academies. A sand table is, in the words of one early 20th century field manual, quote, simply a box mounted on trestles to a convenient height, or a curved table partially filled with sand. Using rakes, trowels, brushes, and hands, the instructor molded and contoured, shaped and arranged the sand to correspond to some real world or imaginary terrain at a set scale. Slopes were sculpted, fields and forests were marked out, streams and rivers were laid in. The scenery was then augmented with models to represent roads, houses, bridges, and other such features. The sand was typically moistened to help it hold its shape. It was also dusted with colored sawdust to add visual interest and further disambiguate the terrain. Finally, either figures or else blots or tokens were deployed to represent the disposition of friendly or enemy bodies of troops. On this landscaping miniature, tactical problems were presented to cadets. When the cadets were called to arms, the sand table technique could go with them. Its scenarios more urgently focused to depict some actual or impending situation at the front. How would you know, asks a lost and confused paratrooper who has just jumped into Normandy in the pitch dark in episode 2 of HBO's Band of Brothers? Because I studied the sand tables, answers his buddy. A more expansive and real-world example comes from the orders to Emiliano Zapata to attack government troops in the Mexican state of Morelos during the Mexican Revolution in 1910. A publication by a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army Journal Infantry School Quarterly, so yes, there is an infantry school quarterly, outlines what transpired and why it was significant. Quote, Zapata glanced at the orders and after, There we are. After a moment of brooding silence, picked up his machete. Using the point, he traced a large, simple figure on the earthen floor of his hut. Looks like a fan, doesn't it? He asked. The fan is all Eastern Morelos, and to take the handle, we must first take all the ribs of the fan. Quickly, he outlined the course of the battle, pinpointing each major campaign on the fan. With his machete, he cut in the rivers, the railroads, the pathways. Occasionally, he bent down and with a handful of loose soil constructed a mountain that would soon become an important stronghold. In a matter of minutes, Emiliano Zapata, a man who could scarcely read or write, had outlined to his lieutenants the course of the campaigns. Saw the quotation. As mentioned, I believe it's appropriate to think in terms of what Shannon Mattern has called an intellectual furnishing. And to quote Shannon, I recognize these furnishings as much more than utilitarian equipment, she writes. Instead, they scaffold our media technologies in particular ways, inform the way human bodies relate to those media in particular ways, and embody knowledge in particular ways. They render complex intellectual and political ideas material and empirical, end quote. Saw Shannon Mattern. How then does the sand table function in this schema? What kind of media technology is it? The single most significant affordance of the sand table, in my view, is that it contains. That is, it is a surface that is also an enclosure. And I'm going to come back to this particular image, but what you're looking at here is a colorized halftone. It's printed that way. It's a very I think, unique effect. And to me, it speaks to this notion of, as a technical printing process, it speaks very much to this notion of containment. So the sand table is a surface that is also an enclosure. The table, its base and edges, its legs and trestles is solid, and indeed must be built to fairly exacting specifications in order that the wood may bear the weight of the sand. The sand itself, however, is malleable and can be shifted and sifted. Its surface appearances are temporary, superficial in the most direct sense. Over and over again, the instruction manuals boast of the ease with which the terrain can be reshaped, the hills and valleys raked smooth and ready to be made over anew, though in practice the same manuals dictate the meticulous care required to properly dress the table, the scenarios or exercises setting forth the number of hours required in their preparation. Even the load-bearing support of the table is not absolutely essential, as a sand table, quote unquote, can be arranged on any suitable expansive ground, as the example of Zapata likewise shows. Given its elemental granularity, going to gloss that by quoting from the recent Textures of the Anthropocene volumes that MIT Press published. Granularity, quote, a density that moves, circulates, shifts, translocates, and transforms. Given its elemental granularity, we might expect to always encounter in the sand table an extremis of fidelity, the equivalent of a multi-megapixel high-resolution display. A photograph of a well-prepared sand table might easily be mistaken for that of an actual terrain by a not too critical observer, suggests one source. This is actually a water table that was built by the Japanese to plan Pearl Harbor. But in fact, the practicalities of the table's construction, its rough and ready nature, just as often dictate more casual correspondence, improvised affinities. Details of the construction of a particular scene or situation involve us in an array of contingent materials. Besides sand, quote, of a grade easily molded, all of the following are commonplace in descriptions of how to prepare the surface of a sand table. So here's our litany. Matchsticks, twigs, moss, cotton, lichen, glass, isinglass, wool, wire, sawdust, powdered paint, putty, clay, chalk, tape, tacks, tin, and celluloid, which is particularly good for representing water. Relationships in space and consistency in scale, the difference between two topographic crests, for example, which can dictate the proper positioning of the body of troops, are more important than atmospheric detail. At least one early sand table manual warns against the danger of distracting pupils with models that too much resemble toys. The table presents a horizontal surface. Its constituents stand or are seated around it in a circle or a semicircle, their gaze directed downward and inward. No small measure of the sand table's power is derived from the ability of students to circumnavigate it, to discover fresh angles and perspectives. A twist of the body, a bend of the neck, and a new line of sight or a new grasp of the terrain may emerge. This in sharp contrast to the maintenance of posture and position that is the essence of the cadets' parade ground drill. The table thus encourages discussion, even dissent about its perimeter, a phenomenon surely counter to the normative regimen of military culture. And I got it. Sorry, there's a slide missing there. The table thus comports well with such traditional ideas as the magic circle in anthropology, a bounded space governed by an alternative set of rules and mores, a distinction reinforced by both the contrast between the rigidity of the table's border and the malleability of its interior. I see what happened. Here's where we're supposed to be. Right, so the table is a bounded space governed by an alternative set of rules and mores, and the malleability of its interior, and by the interior's dramatic miniaturization of terrain, which, as much as the physical edges of the table, define it as other space immediately upon encounter. The sand table opens a space, but it is not a diorama. It is true that both depict miniaturized scenes, but the diorama is a conveyance of spectacle, a tableau, frozen and static. Not coincidentally, perhaps, the diorama is named by Louis Daguerre, the inventor of the eponymous daguerreotype, forerunner to photography, and the concomitant transubstantiation of embodied experience to disembodied image. The sand table, by contrast, is meant to be touched, shaped. The instructor can reach into the space and rearrange its elements, as can any pupil with the instructor's leeway. The table is thus tactile and hands-on, its navigation essayed by small localized adjustments in conjunction with the strategically dominant perspectives of aerial vision, which the table vectors well in advance of the rise of the air services and photo reconnaissance, as written about, of course, by Virilio and others, by the onset of World War I. Nowadays, we would call it a tangible user interface. Manuals and tutorials for sand tables were appearing by the early 20th century, first in Germany and then in Great Britain and the United States, though even by then their use had been well documented for decades. They were a favorite of such giants of the general staff as von Moltke and von Schleifen, partly part of the stock of national legend that Hitler was drawing on in his imagery. The original Kriegsspiel of Georg von Reisswitz was played on a sand table before it was adapted to a system of modular ceramic tiles for presentation to King Frederick Wilhelm III in 1811. Representative of the military manuals is Valentine's Sand Table Exercises. A.W. Valentine, a decorated colonel in His Majesty's Devonshire Regiment, published the first edition in Great Britain in 1931. After the 9th edition, its publication was taken over by another British officer, J.D. Turner, quote, as a result of the lessons of the 1939-45 war. It offers diagrams and directions for how to prepare a sand table for such stock situations as movement before contact and the battle drill for the section in the attack, and the platoon and the section in village fighting and house searching. Still, the discerning military mind may have found it somewhat quaint or lacking by that date, given how the Blitzkrieg had raged and the bodies stank and all that. The 11th edition in 1949 included a note, quote, The experience of the late war showed that the anti-tank defense must be planned and coordinated on the battalion as opposed to the platoon level. Anti-tank defense is therefore not considered in this book, which only deals with platoon tactics. The sand table was eventually adapted for more modern usage, as shown by a 1974 manual from the U.S. Army Armor School at Fort Knox. The U.S. Marine Corps How-To of Tactical Decision Games, meanwhile, is a textbook heavily based on sand table exercises. It was published as late as 1994. In 2003, a manual prepared by the National Interagency Fire Center in cooperation with the Marine Corps advocated for their use in training for wilderness firefighting. Let's see. Now, by the 1960s and 70s, hobbyists had adopted the sand table for staging war games of the sort initially introduced by H.G. Wells in his 1913 book Little Wars, and in another less well-known predecessor volume, 1911's Floor Games. In these circumstances, it was precisely the sand table's visibility as furniture that quickly came to confer subcultural status. The rise of the table literally elevating the childish activity of playing with soldiers from something one did on one's hands and knees to a more adult level. Unlike the military training manuals, which make a point of extolling the sand table's simplicity, in hobbyist circles it was typically depicted as, quote, the ultimate gaming surface and the most complicated to manufacture and maintain. The reasons are several. First, though the surface of the table is endlessly reconfigurable, the table itself is conspicuously solid and permanent, to say nothing of the necessity of storing the array of materials associated with it. A sand table as furniture thus requires dedicated interior space. Typically, this meant a detached home with an excess of square footage. Often a sand table would be communally owned furnishing, the centerpiece of a club. Above all, the dedicated space must be able to support the weight of the table. As one hobbyist relates, quote, nearly 40 cubic feet of wet sand weighed so much that if you built one in the loft without strengthening the joists first, you would have found that over the next few seconds you were fighting your battle in the first floor bedroom, the sitting room, and finally the cellar. Gary Gygax is also to the point, baby, that sand is heavy, better put it in the basement or the like. It is thus a quintessentially suburban installation not suitable for apartments. Sand, seemingly weightless in the individual grain, quickly threatens to overwhelm civilian architecture when deployed in aggregate. Don Featherstone, a name as recognizable in British hobbyist circles as Gygax's is here, enumerates other distinctly domestic hazards, underscoring the sand's messiness, its propensity for ending up on the floor from which it must be swept, its capacity to harbor vermin, and unpleasant odors arising from the wet sand and pigments. A standard hobby joke has a sand table summarily annexed as the most epic of cat boxes. Prior to their comparatively more enduring uptake by the hobbyist community, sand tables also seem to have enjoyed an early 20th century vogue in educational circles, especially as aids to Bible instruction in Sunday school classrooms. Quote, even the little tots are intensely interested in the portrayal of Bible stories on the sand table, we are assured, and here in this image it catches the interest of the boys. The enthusiasm for them appears to have been of a piece with a more general recognition of the role of visual media in education, such as illustrated picture books. Here, especially when juxtaposed with this wartime German publication, the sand table's status as children's media is eerily reinforced. Regardless, it was perhaps a natural step to enlist the existing sand box to serve as a visual prop for storytelling, but to picture the story as nearly as possible, as another source has it. Perhaps the power of world-making was also not lost upon these ecclesiastical advocates, a series of pages instructing the reader on how to make the varied components necessary to illustrate Bible stories, how to make sheep, how to make a boat or a house, how to make people, how to make angels, hints, water, grass, flowers, fruit, and trees. And finally, how to make the sun, the moon, and the stars is followed almost of necessity by the first lesson, which is, of course, the Genesis story of the creation. Meanwhile, at the Perkins School for the Blind near Boston, they were used to teach students geography by touch. A 2012 propaganda video by Syrian anti-government rebels prominently features a sand table being used to help plan an attack on a missile battery. Blocks, toys, and labels denote the tactical landscape. More striking, however, is what comes immediately after the sand table sequence in the video. Footage of a disembodied hand using Google Earth imagery to trace what may or may not be the same terrain. Regardless that the sand table is rhetorically juxtaposed with computer mapping technology in a context clearly intended to exhibit the martial prowess and tactical sophistication of the anti-government fighters, testifies to the extent to which it occupies a resonant place in the military imagination, connoting as it does premeditation of intent, operational intelligence, and contingency planning. A particularly uncanny exemplar further demonstrates the affordances linking sand table modeling to the trajectory of optics and surveillance, whose contemporary apotheosis is geographic information systems, both open and clandestine. In 2006, Google Earth aficionados in Germany spotted an optical anomaly. Several kilometers of terrain in China's remote Huangyangtang region, I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that properly, that appeared to closely duplicate a 450-kilometer swath of territory occupied by China in the 1962 war, but claimed by India in the Karakoram mountain range, some 2,400 miles distant. So here is the Google Earth imagery of the sand table model in China, several kilometers in extent. And here is the Google Earth imagery of the actual disputed region. The Chinese model includes glaciers, snow-capped mountains, and rivers embedded in an area otherwise described as an arid plain. Barracks and other signs of military infrastructure are also visible nearby, leading one to the conclusion that this topographic mezzanine is a massive sand table, certainly the largest ever constructed. Having rehearsed now some of the historical particulars and affordances of the sand table in situ, I want to step back and talk about what brought me to the topic. Though I'm a hobby gamer myself, I've never played a game on a sand table. I became interested in them instead through their photographic representations, many of which I've been sharing with you today. Only later did I take any special notice of Hitler's passing reference, though I have read the passage in question many times. Upon consideration, however, I think the photographs actually have an effect, which is to say, an affect, apart from their merely illustrative function. Partly this is a result of the intensity with which they capture gazes vectored on particular points. They thus offer a dramatic exposure to what Nicholas Mirzoff has termed the right to look, especially reinforced by the visual ergonomics of seemingly gigantic bodies, even when the bodies are children's bodies looming over miniaturized terrain. Today we understand that with real-time telemetry and Hellfire missiles, the right to look is also often the view to a kill. Multimedia artist Brian Comley takes up exactly this complex of images of issues in his 2007 and 2010 performance pieces entitled Miniature War in Iraq and Now Afghanistan, respectively. Comley describes the genesis of the project in his observation of tabletop wargamers and his interest in using that niche pastime as a vector of critique for contemporary medial forms of participation and observation. He collaborated with the Kansas City-based Heart of America Historical Miniatures Gaming Society to stage a public war game based on recent conflicts. Unlike the typical recreational wargamer, however, Comley employed native Arabic speakers to research competing versions of events, working from, as he describes it, the New York Times and Al Jazeera, as well as militant Islamic websites, US military sources, American soldiers' selfies and combat videos, and real-time exchanges with Iraqi bloggers. A very large sand table model was then constructed as the platform for the piece, which included a recreation of a village and date palm grove in the Zargar region near Najaf, and subsequently a Baghdad neighborhood. Crucially, the sand table itself functioned as an integral component of the rules of this art game. Because of its physical size, the table was actually 4 modular units abutted together. Only insurgent players were allowed to pull the table open to move soldiers and material in its interior. The Americans, however, were able to leverage a unique asset consisting of a participant who, as we see here, was suspended in a harness above the table, holding a model drone in one hand, and with the other controlling an electronic joystick that allowed her, it was a her, to swoop back and forth above the table, thereby to collect intelligence and order strikes. So I have some video of this that I'll play too. It's about 6 minutes long. I certainly won't play all of it, but I'll play a minute or two at the start and then jump to a point in a little bit further along.
That's why I would like to turn And the game starts from a real event in Afghanistan that actually happened just a few days ago. And after this real beginning is established in the game takes off on its own. It uses its own rules. It uses, players use war strategy. They use, there's rolls of the dice that are involved as well. So the game kind of evolves through both strategy and chance simultaneously, just like war. Each time we play do this project, we pick, the research team picks an event that's actually happened in the location that we're playing the game about. In this case, it's Afghanistan. And tonight, what we're playing is this event that happened a few days ago in which 4 Pakistani workers were shot dead in Kandahar. And the story goes like this. 5 persons, including 4 Pakistani construction workers, were killed in an ambush near Afghan city of Kandahar on Thursday. This was last Thursday. Later,
I'm going to skip ahead, but I would just, I think one obvious thing to point to is the role of screens here, the way in which I think Comley is very much interested not just in the table per se and the miniature figures and such, but he's also interested in media and the medial relationship to these events that he's describing. And just to give you, here's the segment with the drone.
Like when can I?
A level surface, so we don't have a cocked out. All three up. Flesh wound. Oh, look at that stripe. Killed him. Blew a leg off.
What? Oh, now you see my guy. Look. So this one then. Which one's the dead?
Anyway, it's certainly available on YouTube for those who see the rest. So Comley describes the dynamics of the performance in this way. Quote, players roll the dice and move the playing pieces by hand. They reach across the table, crane their necks for sight lines, crouch to measure distances, yet the whole tower, yet all the while tower gigantically above the fray. So that same visual dynamic. This tension is emphasized in the miniature war video of the 2007 Game and Play. Sorry, not this video in particular. I think he's referring to a different video, where all we see are the godlike hands of players reaching in from out of the frame to gather up or knock over figures up in vehicles or dismantle buildings. The magic circle of absorptive involvement is made tangible in miniature war, even as it is exaggerated to an extreme, almost caricatural level. So this emphasis on the table and the frame and the peculiar visual dynamics thus conjured further underscores the way in which the sand table functions as its own site of exceptionalism in its medial representations. This is dramatized in the series of colorized halftones I mentioned earlier from one particular field manual, Major T.W. Slocum's Building and Modeling Sand Tables, 1955. More generally, the contrast in scale, coupled with the rectilinear shape of the table inside of the literal frame of other photographs, functions, I'll assert, as a distinctive kind of mise-en-scène, lending many of these images their peculiar power. And I'm going to close with an example. This is Lyndon Johnson in the White House Situation Room sometime in early 1968. He is studying a sand table depicting in something very close to real time the current state of operations at Khe Sanh, where an outpost of Marines was surrounded by some 40,000 North Vietnamese regulars. It is common knowledge that Johnson was obsessed with Khe Sanh, seeing in it the potential for a repeat of the great French debacle at Dien Bien Phu a decade and a half earlier, which had ended their colonial occupation. As the battle, really more of a siege, unfolded over a 6-month span, an army historian was tasked with researching the French defeat and keeping Johnson and his staff up to date with new developments. The White House sand table, a mirror image of an even larger one on the ground in Saigon, was the centerpiece of these often daily briefings used to plot moves and counter moves. Quote, I projected their timetable and predicted their attack to the day, a week or 10 days before it happened. Writer Thomas Allen claims the same army historian subsequently told him. Such precognition notwithstanding, the base at Khe Sanh eventually fell, though most of the Marine garrison was successfully extracted. There was no second Dien Bien Phu. The official White House photograph, however, has been reprinted often. The sand table's material presence as furnishing in the Situation Room, clearly coming to function as an index to the extremity of Johnson's fixation, even as it captures the simultaneous power and impotence of the American position in Vietnam. This exacting reconstruction of a remote countryside erected in the halls of power, enclosed in a box, overlain with a grid, Johnson and his aides towering and glowering above. Note the telltale body language. One man, it looks like Walt Bristow with his finger outstretched, almost but not quite to touch, like a god. One standing off to one side, arms crossed in study, and Johnson himself leaning in, hands braced, gaze almost straight down. He seems to be scrying. Surely there is an angle here, a posture. Surely the situation can be determined. Thank you. And we have time for questions, I'm sure. Yes?
This might seem like an odd question, but it just was striking to me, particularly with the Sunday school sand tables. I think you sort of gestured at the pleasure of mastery over the situation, the sandbox and parts. But it's striking to me that there's also kind of just a pleasure in seeing small things. And I don't know where to go beyond that.
Yeah.
But those seem to be, in fact, twins.
Yeah, I mean, so obviously the sort of radical disjunction in scale has something to do with that sort of, those feelings of mastery and control. But yeah, there is that kind of more sort of affective, just pleasurable sense as well. I think where I would go, and this is something I need to reread, I know that Susan Stewart has written about this in a book called On Longing, where she sort of talks about these contrasts in scale between the miniature and the gigantic and such.
This is sort of related to the last question. You know, I was struck by, I guess following Kittler, the presence of militarism here and tracing the sandbox back to its military context. I'm sorry, the sand table back to military context. But you know, you mentioned briefly the schools and the Sunday schools. My kids go to a Montessori school. They've always had a sand table in their classroom. Could you not trace a different history back to childhood pleasure and play and arrive at rather different conclusions than the sort of dire finger of the god there? It's not that they might be related as well. I was trying to remember if you know Mark Twain's The Mysterious Stranger. Isn't there a moment where the kids are playing with toys in the sand and they're sort of like gods of the sandbox, and then later the mysterious stranger like gets them in the same way?
Yeah, I haven't read that, so that's something to look at. But yeah, and somebody, when I presented this at SCMS, somebody told me that they're also used therapeutically, specifically for treating PTS, post-traumatic stress disorder. And you know, there's a kind of element of play and recreation there. And so, you know, yes, I think there are differing genealogies. One is there's the genealogy, again, between sort of narration and computation or calculation that I gestured to. There's also, I think, the different sort of civic contexts in which one might place the sand table. I do think certainly the martial contexts are where they've been most thoroughly documented. And you know, I think it's hard for me to imagine a history of the sand table without due attention to that. Stuart?
Matt, what do you think the relationship is between the sand table as a medium and immersive three-dimensional things in video games and other?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we saw it in that first video clip. I think very sort of explicitly, self-consciously so for a number of HCI designers who have sort of rediscovered the sand table. It's a kind of point of origin. So you get sort of, you know, in the augmented reality video, you get the sand table plus, right? The sand table only better, right? So it becomes a remediation. And you know, I think part of what interests me more generally, this is another kind of frame that we might put around this, is the contrast between horizontal and vertical media. So we, in media studies, we spend a lot of time talking about what we might think of as vertical media, right? Screens, windows, and so forth. And there is this sort of counter tradition of horizontal media. We talk about it sometimes, when we talk about things like the tabletop Pac-Man games that you used to see in pizza joints and so forth. And nowadays, I think there's more interest in those kinds of tangible surfaces, right? You see this very much with something like the Microsoft Surface. And I think part of the sort of lesson here from the sand table tradition is that there's something about the kind of social communal space that those horizontal surfaces seem to facilitate, right? And so, I think that's kind of a wider frame to put around this, and part of my interest is in thinking this sort of early manifestation of this work through in relation to, some of those more contemporary augmented reality, 2D tangible user interface things that are very much in vogue nowadays. Yes?
Since we're talking about frames, I'll stick with the frame as a way into this somewhat half-baked question. I really love this example of this how you use the sand table to trace the materiality of these speculative media. So, and I see. I was really interested in your description of the sand table. So you have this frame that reminds me very much of like a photograph frame or a film frame in which you have something that is happening within the frame of the observable, right? And so I see a lot of relationships there, and I wondered if you might talk about how you might bridge that, or how it might be discontinuous with things like simulation and computer modeling of complex systems. So, I'm thinking of if I can be selfish and put in something that I'm interested in here,
please.
the modeling of complex and dynamic systems like climate change or epidemiology, in which you have various systems that are beyond the frame of the observable, that are coming into play and shaping what's happening in the sandbox. Could you talk about the relationship between, are there disjunctures there, or do you see a way to stitch those two things together?
Yeah, part of, so the first thing I sort of think about is that historically, particularly within these sort of, traditions of military instruction, the sand table was used for what was termed tactical instruction, tactical as opposed to strategic situations. So, you weren't concerned with the movements of armies and nations, you were concerned with very sort of localized problems like, how do you get around or how do you get on top of that hill, right? What's the best way to do that from the standpoint of military science? And so, there's certainly, this gets back, I think, to the question about miniaturization as well. There may be a kind of, there may be sort of inherent limitations, right, in terms of what at least the true analog sand table is capable of usefully modeling. I suspect some of the allure of the augmented reality systems is that they are, particularly when coupled with things like Google Earth imagery and sort of sourcing your terrain overlays from Google Earth, they become, potentially much more sort of expensive in that way. There's also, the other way I would come at it is to, the examples that you gave, epidemiology and, other kinds of complex system dynamics seem to me to be very sort of, they're abstract topics there. It's hard to sort of achieve that kind of mapping that is really the, in some ways that's where that kind of, visual and tactile pleasure of the sand table comes from, the sort of efficacy of that mapping between that big hill out there in the real world and this mound of sand on the tabletop that nonetheless represents that hill at scale. And the same for things like, houses and, other terrain features. And so there's a, this is just thinking loosely, but it seems to me that I would want to do some more thinking about the sort of nature of systems as such and how we distinguish or how we use a term like abstraction versus materiality, or the material in relation to systems thinking. What kinds of systems do we sort of identify as abstract in some fashion, and what kinds of systems are sort of tactical or localized in ways that would lend themselves to sand table modeling. Those are just my, it's a very provocative question, but those are my initial ideas around it.
Thank you.
Yeah, Matt, it's really a great, I think, project, and one that's clearly, as you said, in the beginning stages, because, and I don't know if you're thinking about a book or something like that, but just to throw some things out there. As people have been saying, one way to think about bookifying it would be to taxonomize a bit and think about the differences between these, let's say, military uses and Sunday school uses or pedagogical uses or play, ludic uses and things like that. And in particular, I guess that's one, so let me just sort of all things out, then I'll sort of ask a question. I really think the granularity bit in the connection with digital media is really interesting. Think about pixels versus grains, and also the way in which, we talk about the digital surface and the digital medium as being so malleable and fluid. This really does become a kind of precursor of that in really interesting sorts of ways. And I think that's really fascinating. And I think what you say about the horizontal as well is interesting. I think about model railroads as being another space of horizontality. I think about sand castles in general. Which is to say that I think that, to start thinking about the sand table is actually to realize that it is you know, a site that you pull on various strings and you get, you know, all these traditions intersecting with it. So anyway, I think it's, yeah, I think it's really great, and I think the placement of that Kidler, you know, paragraph is just beautiful. The question I have, though, or another and sort of suggestion is, I was thinking a bit about the early Latour essay called Drawing Things Together, and I don't know if that's one that you've come across. It's not in any of the books, I don't think. And it's about visualization and cognition. And what his argument there is that the space of the screen or the page or whatever becomes a place, what he calls in Science and Action, a center of calculation, where by manipulating things on a screen, you can actually be controlling things. They're connected to things in the world. And I think one of this paper seemed to me to be very much about the sand table as a formal artifact in a lot of ways, but and then this goes back to thinking about its different uses.
Yes.
But there are ways in which when they move, when Johnson and his people are moving around, you know, whatever they're moving around, in essence, that is connected in some way through a chain of, you know, mediations to large military forces or to, you know, decisions on the ground. And so it becomes like this almost wizardry, magical space where you can, like, you know, you're working on that. So anyway, I think there's just so much.
Although the burden of that image is that it's out of control. Right? I mean, as much as they move the pieces around, they're going to lose.
Right, but it is both out of control and they are controlling. It is moving forces.
Right.
You know.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And yeah, it's, I mean, that's all really useful. Thank you. And I particularly like sort of, I think you're right that the emphasis on the connection between what's happening on the tabletop and the real world, so-called, is the one to put pressure on, and all those layers of transmission and mediation that sort of flow outward from the situation room and back again. You know, this wasn't to talk about word processing, but it does, it reminds me, in fact, very much of the plot of Stephen King's short story, The Word Processor of the Gods, which, you know, figures in the book that I'm currently finishing. And if you don't know the story, it's about a writer who discovers a word processor, and this word processor has the wondrous and terrifying power of, when something is deleted on the screen, that object is deleted from the real world, and when something is inserted on the screen, that object is placed into the real world. And it, you know, and so the writer in the story then essentially begins to copy, edit, and revise his own life. But it's very much, I think, the same kind of connection, right? I mean, that's, yeah, so, yeah.
I think one of the things that confused me is that the objects that are placed on the sand table, the physical objects like trees or houses, are a different thing from the sand, right? And, and they come from a different kind of modeling tradition, and I think when they both occupy that space, something else is going on than just the manipulation of sand. And so that when you get into the augmented reality table, I mean, it's notable for not having any kind of objects in it, right?
Right.
And what seems to happen in these things is the introduction of things from outside the sand table, in the case of like the biblical stories or something like that. And I think of one, everyone's going to bring their own, but the one I think about is this crazy-ass full-scale model of a 1949 Ringling Brothers circus, which is installed in a museum in Florida. Basically, it was a lifetime of work for this person, but you know, it begins with sand, right? Because it's a full-scale model of this thing. And that has to be done, and then he brings his train in and unpacks the train, and everything else happens too. So, but there's a difference, it seems to me, between the things that get stuck on the sand and the sand itself.
Right, well, you know, the sand is, of course, a natural resource, right? But yeah, and you know, I think this is also where the relationship between the sand table and the diorama begins to become important, and the kind of repeated warnings that you actually would encounter in these old training manuals that saw lavishing too much time on the preparation of the terrain or the painting of the miniature figures. You know, that it's sort of like the conversation we have about games today. We're concerned that our games are serious games, and so we don't want them to be mistaken for toys.
Well, one is a kind of abstract thinking, and the other one is a kind of trying to make a replica, right? Mm-hmm. And so you could imagine that if you're trying to teach people to think abstractly in terms of strategy, you don't want them to think too specifically, right?
Right. Yeah, and again, the situations that you would see sort of presented in those training manuals were all very sort of generic things, right? So, yeah, that's helpful. Yeah. In the back, and then further down. So, back first. Yeah.
That's me, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So, thinking about the extent to which the appeal is little things, well, I think it's like little things that you're in control of, that you stand over them. You say the godlike position in the end.
Yeah.
And that really made me think of something that I think you could integrate as you pursue this, which would be the genre of computer games known as god games.
Yeah.
Which I believe was initiated with Populous, which is very literally a sand table type of environment. It's a 3D landscape. The little people are running around.
Yeah.
You're the godlike figure.
Yes.
And your power is essentially to raise and lower pieces of the terrain. So, although you have
and bestow resources, right?
What you do, civilization is more resources. I mean, Populous, that you have little people and they're building houses, and you want your tribe to win. But as God, what you can do primarily is raise and lower terrain to make nice flat pieces. And then the little piece people kind of take care of the resources. But you primarily are just raising and lowering terrain. You do something like an earthquake or a volcano, it's changing the terrain. So you want your side to win, but your control basically is over the sand-like reconfigurable environment. So that.
What was, I know there was a,
in the game literature as God games.
Yes. There was one in particular, there was one from several years back that I remember hearing a lot about. Was Black and White, was it called?
Yes.
Is that the one?
Yeah.
Is that what it's actually called? Black
it's called Black and White.
Okay, yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah, no, absolutely. And, again, I think, yes, it seems to me sort of inarguable that there's what we're really talking about with both sound tables on the one hand and god games on the other is a larger sort of kind of relationship, perceived relationship to mediated spaces, right? And desires of particular kinds that get projected onto whether it's the tabletop surface or the dynamics of the computer god game in motion, right? So, it's partly, I think, going to be so it's going to be, again, that question of how the topic becomes circumscribed. It's a very good suggestion.
Which, bearing in mind also the earlier question about global warming and things, I think what can happen in the computer environment that can't happen with the literal sandbox is that more and more of the dynamics get programmed in, and it leads to things like Sim Earth, or Sim City, where you have that same kind of looking in from outside, from above, everything is little.
Yeah.
But the dynamics are all automated, so it does begin to represent a complex system.
Yeah.
If you look at the static snapshot, it looks a lot like a sandbox. There's stuff going on algorithmically inside it.
Yeah, I think about, not just the military games, but also their use by firefighters, for example, wilderness firefighters, where it seems to me that the obvious thing that you could do with the augmented reality version is actually let the fire burn and manipulate variables like wind and air temperature and so forth, and see how your virtual fire develops in that environment. And so, I think, obviously there's the potential for expanding the sort of palette of what can be effectively modeled. Okay. Question?
Yeah, I was really interested when you first introduced the comparison between the diorama and the sand table, because the experience of space is really different, even in a three-dimensional representation like a diorama, where you're still, you're fixed and just looking at it. And it seems to be in a sand table where you're experiencing space, kinesthetically as well as tangibly.
Right.
So I was wondering, you seem to be emphasizing a lot in your presentation the right to look, but the right to touch seems to be really effective in the sand table, and I was wondering.
Yeah, and and I think what's particularly interesting is that the right to touch lends itself to sort of formalization, perhaps more than the right to look. So, one example would be, again, whether or not the student has the right to sort of touch and rearrange things on the table, or is that only the teacher or the officer?
Sort of move through it.
Yeah, but then, in particular, I think, an even more compelling example is the one from Brian Plumlee's art game, where, what he does is, he uses the question of who can touch what. So, for example, who can touch the figures in the interior spaces of the table as a way of sort of metaphorically, but also functionally mapping, the asymmetrical sort of capabilities of the two sides. And so there, the right to touch functions instrumentally or operationally to sort of actualize a particular interpretation of what's happening within that scene. But yeah, it's definitely as important as the right to look. Yeah.
But on the contrast is fascinating.
The contrast, yeah, thank you.
So, just to follow that up, I mean, it would be interesting to think about this in relation to sort of McLuhan's version of the history of media, which is not obviously just McLuhan's version, Ong's and others, but the standard movement from orality to print and the domination of the visual to electric media, which for McLuhan are distinguished by their hapticity and their sense of touch. So the question I think one might ask in putting those together would be, one, do the sand tables go in and out of sort of fashion or use in a way that reinforces that larger narrative?
Right.
Or in fact, is there another trajectory running through the history of media, a trajectory both of horizontality and of tactility, that in fact might challenge or question this dominant kind of accepted logic that that we've taken from McLuhan? I think that's pretty much, it's not unquestioned, but it really is a pretty commonly accepted sense of a movement of media history.
Right.
And I don't know the answer to that, but it seems to me that that would be a really interesting way to, sort of approach those relations.
Yeah.
And I'd suggest that 3D game interfaces play a really important role in that possible narrative.
In the sense that they remediate the sort of tactile dimension.
Yeah, though I don't think it's an altogether successful remediation. In some ways, what's interesting about it is how it fails.
Yeah, and the short answer is I don't know the answer either, but my instinct is, at least within the military context, which as pointed out is the one that I've looked at most extensively, their use seems to be fairly constant in the sense that every sort of decade or two there's another wave of these manuals and textbooks, and often accompanied by a kind of sort of minor evangelical mode. Look, sand table, despite this high-tech world that we live in, the ancient sand table still has its uses, right? And so you find that kind of language in the preparatory matter. So I think this notion of a kind of counter tradition, counter sort of tradition to the standard media history is an important one.
So does that suggest then that the strand table as a military strategic tool will have to disappear if battles don't happen someplace? In other words, part of what we're seeing, right, is that war doesn't happen in a place anymore, right? So, I mean, and all these are about modeling a location where something happened, and the location becomes less important.
And this is certainly, I think I can acknowledge this is part of the visual appeal to me too. There's a nostalgic dimension to a lot of this imagery, and it may have.
We all think of the good old days of war, yeah.
Well, right, hitting the movement over the table, right?
That's pretty clean in that.
Yeah, I mean, where the scenario was observable. But more more generally too, nostalgic in terms of things like model railroads and, the sandbox and, the other sort of, pastimes of childhood that have been mentioned. But, I think that, this gets back to the question about more other forms of data visualization. And there are sort of war games that are played out algorithmically that revolve around things like net-centric warfare and cyber warfare. They don't lend themselves to visualization and concretization in this kind of linear fashion. But that's yet another way in which I suppose one can sort of spin the traditions and counter-traditions of this kind of modeling.
I'd be double dipping, so if anybody else.
Oh, I double dipped.
Oh, well. I mean, ever since Tom's question in the back, I've sort of been thinking about we have the still photograph there, kind of frozen in time, and I'm thinking about your presentation of the sand table is kind of reconfigurable, right? And it is, you can move the sand, but it seems that, the thing about the sand table is it's slowly reconfigurable. It's reconfigurable with difficulty. And I wonder if there's, not just in a sort of spatial realm or in terms of the loss of landscape, but what the sand table gives you is a kind of access to slow time, right? Tom's dynamic computer systems, they can do climate modeling, thousands of years, they can process it in a moment and visualize it for you very quickly. But kind of what you get here is the slowing down of vast, complex processes into something that's, not quite the geological scale, but that certainly is a lot of trouble if you want to move it around, right?
Yeah, and that's a fabulous observation and way of putting it. And I think there is a sense in which I was a little bit sort of fast and loose with the sand, in that, in fact, what the sort of manuals describe in terms of the minutiae of how the table would be prepared is, I did mention at one point the labor involved, that it would take hours to sort of prepare a well-appointed sand table. And it would be the sort of thing that you could sort of set up and break down in a day. But I think part of the appeal, too, of the augmented reality platforms, you see it in the video, just the casual ease, like waves on the ocean with which the sand is moved around and sort of resculpted. But I think it's very. I think it's very much true that if there's a temporal dynamic that needs to be further articulated. Right.
But even that they give us something that digital media is quite bad at, right? The digital media is bad at slowness and sand is bad at fastness.
You can't click through, right? You can't click through or, flip the Kindle page or whatever it is. So, thank you for that.
So we have a tradition of a horizontal table on the 9th floor that has some drink and some food. So why don't we continue this conversation over that table? And maybe we'll start moving things around today in ways that we haven't. So thanks.
Thank you, everyone. That was some great feedback as well.